Hey there, happy Wednesday. Today we're going to talk about how I light a scene outdoors with no lights. Pretty much only using this big guy right here, the sun. Lighting daylight exteriors is probably one of the more common things that I run into on sets, whether it be for a commercial, a documentary, corporate work. Almost every project has at least one shot outdoors, I feel like, and I light all of them pretty much the same way. The only thing that really differs is the level of polish. So that's kind of what I'm gonna break down today using a little stupid demo scene that I shot yesterday. So without further ado, let's roll that, and then we'll get into how I go about lighting something like this. Like I said, just stupid little scene, but jumping into this scene, the first thing that I do when I'm lighting any sort of daylight exterior is I'm gonna look at the sun path. And I do this using the app Sunseeker. This is like a paid app, I think it's like 15 bucks, but it's very worth it. If you don't wanna spend $15 on that, there's a free app that does kind of the same thing called Lumos. Pretty much you just put it up to the sky, kind of move it around, and you can see where the sun's gonna be. This is super crucial for lighting anything outdoors. More so if it's just more than like kind of one shot, because maybe if it's one shot, you can kind of run out and just guess and figure it out. But if you're trying to light a whole scene, you're basically working with a moving key light. So planning out your shots to the sun path is super important. That may sound more complicated than it is, but it's honestly really simple. Pretty much all I do is I work backwards from my wide shot to my close-ups. So when I'm on that scout, I'm looking to see when is the light gonna be absolute best. And that's when I'm shooting my wide shot, because with wides, if we're just lighting with daylight, we don't really have the ability to kind of manipulate stuff, especially at the level that I'm working at. So that's just gonna be natural stock daylight. So we're not gonna be doing anything to that, so we want our light to be the prettiest when we're shooting that shot. For this scene, it's supposed to feel kind of like golden hour, sunset-ish, so I knew that I wanted the sun to be pretty low in the sky, but high enough that it was still gonna kind of hit a little bit on the side of her head and maybe streak across the grass in the backyard. So knowing that, I knew that that shot was gonna happen probably around 7:30. So from that, I then worked backwards to where my first shot was gonna be, and that was at about 6. Now, obviously that's an hour and a half time period, and the sun is gonna be moving that entire time. So you may be saying like, well, aren't people gonna notice that the sun has moved? Yes and no. With closer stuff, you can manipulate it a lot to kind of make it feel like whatever you want it to be. You can't do that with wides, which is why you shoot the wide last. But with the close-ups and the medium shots, you can kind of manipulate them enough to feel like whatever your wide shot is gonna be, or at least get them in the world of it. Once all the planning's out of the way and it was time to actually shoot the thing, I got started with my close-ups. So first thing I set up when I'm doing this is my key light or my bounce. For this, I used a 6x6 of bleached muslin. I prefer it to using like an ultra bounce material. I think it has less of a sheen and kind of just looks more natural to bounce light with. I put that on the camera right side. That's very important. So when you're bouncing light, a lot of the time people will put it on the opposite side. So like whatever side is like 180 degrees from the sun. Let me do a little diagram here to kind of show you. So you always want your bounce to be on the sun side. This is gonna make it feel much more natural. If you're coming from the other side, which you get a lot more output from, which is that kind of 180 degrees from the sun, you'll get way more output out of it, but it's gonna feel unnatural. And that would just feel like, why is there two suns? We live on Earth, we don't have two suns. So bouncing from the sun side is a super, super important thing to do. And then with that, you're obviously not gonna get as much output. And so the way you kind of have to angle it to get the output is, so you put the bounce as close to your talent as possible, and then you kind of open it up until you start to see that light kind of streaking in onto the bounce material. And this part here is really the dance with it, because, you know, you want to get as much output, but you also need it to hit the talent. So kind of that tilting it in and out and opening it up to the sun more is gonna probably take the longest here, kind of feathering it and figuring out where the perfect level of output to actual hitting the talent. One other thing that you want to keep in mind when you're kind of positioning your muslin or your bounce is that you want to make sure it's coming from higher than the subject, because in most case scenarios, light is not coming from the ground, so we want our light to be coming from where light would normally come from, which is kind of above our talent. So I have the bounce kind of placed so it's high enough that like the bottom of it is like almost like at like shoulder height. So it's like pretty high up in the air. And again, that's gonna cut your output, but it's gonna make it feel much more natural. The whole kind of game with this is kind of figuring out how much output versus realistic placement you can get. And sometimes you have to kind of make it a little unrealistic if you don't maybe have the best angle in the sun. But you know, you wanna kind of get it as high and as on the sun side as possible.
Hey there, little editor's note here. Totally forgot to talk about one of the things I used here, which was a 4x4 of quarter grid, I think it was, just to kind of kick down the exposure on that hard edge a little bit. The hard edge is just the sun. I like having a little bit of that when I'm lighting outdoor scenes. The sun hit the face a little bit, but here it was just like a little bit too strong, so I took it down with some diffusion. If you don't want that hard edge, just turn your town a little bit and that will go away, but I like it. So anyways, back to the video.
So for this shot, it literally just was that bounce and then that diffusion overhead just to kind of kill that harsh little line there a little bit. I like to kind of have a little bit of a hard sun on the face because I think it makes it feel more real. In real life, we have these harsh lights, like not everything is beautiful and perfect. And so to me, I really like that. But again, like I said, you can just kind of turn the talent a little bit if you don't want to have that. Moving on to our next shot here, which is our kind of medium shot of the talent, kind of thumbing through the male. Again, for this, super simple. Literally all we did was just back everything off. Because now we have a wider frame, we have to back stuff off a little bit. So we backed off that 6x6 bounce, we backed off that 4x4 frame, and then this is somewhere in the world of what we were left with. Now, as you can see, it's not wrapping as much because we aren't able to have that as close. If you did want it to kind of have the same amount of wrappiness, which I know I say the word wrappy a lot in my videos, I'm realizing, but if you wanted to kind of get that level of wrap, you can use a bigger bounce. Personally, when I'm doing outdoor scenes, I like to use like normally either an 8x or a 12x. 12x preferable, but a lot of the times I have an 8x available to me, so I use that. This is with a 6x, so it can start to feel a little bit punchy or saucy, you know, kind of backing it off for these medium shots, but I think this feels fine here. And so again, we just kind of have that 4x overhead, just diffusing that hard light a little bit, and then that bounce kind of just helping us to key and wrap that light around our talent's face. The other thing that I added here was a 8x8 of negative fill. This, again, you could just use a black bed sheet or a black blanket if you don't have like a big, like actual like film negative fill. You just need something dark that will take away light. With our close-up, we didn't really need it, just the angle of her face, like it was fine, like we just didn't need any. But for this, being kind of more open to the world, it just felt like our shadows were maybe a little bit too murky, a little too lifted. So by putting that 8x neg on our camera left here, that kind of helped to just kind of close it off a little bit and give us a little bit more contrast, which I'm a fan of in images, kind of having a little bit more contrast. After that, we flipped our world around a little bit for our reverse shot, and I'm sure you can guess really the only change that we made was we just moved everything back in again. Pretty much when you're doing close-ups, move everything as close as possible, and then when you're doing wider shots, just back everything off until it's just out of frame. And that's a pretty good reference for kind of doing this outdoor lighting if you want it to kind of feel natural, is just always try to get it as close as possible as your talent, but out of frame. For this shot here, we had our 4x4 frame just over camera left here, taking down a little bit of that kind of harsh light that's hitting the hands. So we're still getting, you know, some nice sunlight hitting here, but it's not as hard. At this point, I believe the sun had kind of dropped to a point where like we weren't even really getting that much of hard light. So it was just kind of ambient soft across the hands and then diffused a little bit with that quarter grid to make it even a little bit softer. We probably honestly could have gotten away with not even using any diffusion here, but we already had it up, so I used it. And then again, we had our bounce just over here, kind of outside of camera. And that was kind of, again, just kind of helping to add a little bit of level and wrap over the hands here. Also, to kind of have this kind of level on the grass here, we actually had to move like way up towards the street because where the sun had moved to at this point, it was like no longer hitting this grass, so it was just all super dark and just didn't feel nice. So I wanted to have a nice gradient across the grass. So to do that, I moved to where the sun was still kind of streaking across and gave us that kind of nice highlight on this grass and on the mailbox here. And then again, we had our neg on this side over here, and that was just kind of helping to add this contrast that you're seeing here. And that was it for that shot. After that, it was time for our final shot, which was the wide shot, and we hit it at the perfect timing that we had planned for, and the sun was doing exactly what I wanted it to do. It was just streaking right across the yard here, backlighting all these trees, backlighting this house, and just barely etching out the side of her face and body, kind of helping to give her some shape. So for this, literally all we did was just move all of our frames and stands out of the way, move the camera back, and shoot it. Simple as that. These wide shots are really gonna be your most simple shots. The really hard thing about it is just making sure that you're staying on schedule to be able to hit it, because the sun does not give a shit about what you're shooting. It's gonna set no matter what. So this is really a time when, you know, you can't be running behind schedule. You need to be hitting your time marks, because otherwise you will not get your shots and you will be sad. And that's pretty much it. It's pretty easy. I'd say this is easier than lighting with actual lights, because you already have your key light up. You are just kind of bouncing it back in to return it. So to kind of recap here, know where your sun is gonna be, use Lumos or Sunseeker to figure out that sun path and plan your shots accordingly. Start with those close-ups and work your way out to your wide shot. When you're setting up your balance, make sure it's up high and coming from the sun side, so that way it is feeling the most natural that it can feel. And make sure you're staying on schedule, because the sun does not care what you are shooting and it's gonna set. So that's it. Hopefully this wasn't confusing and was helpful to you. If it wasn't, sorry, I tried. And I'll see you next week. Bye.